decided to wait because something that came across my email. I don't know how many of you get those daily quotes from Tricycle. You get them, yeah. Um, they always just have a quote, and you can follow through to see who wrote the quote, and then you can go back to the article that they had written or whenever it was, and sometimes they're like as far back as 2017 or 18, or they're all over the place, but they just put a quote every day. And the one that inspired me that came by in the last week or so was from a Tricycle article with Christina Feldman and Jaya Rudgard, and it was from September of 2021, about mindfulness, about the many shades of mindfulness, and about mindfulness and the brightening qualities of the mind. How mindfulness is also then part of the 7 factors of enlightenment. So, mindfulness is a word that's been absorbed into our culture. And it's important to appreciate the depth and the nuances of what it can actually offer. And so when I got referred back to that article and I went to look at it, Christina Feldman is an author of a number of books. One of them is called Compassion and the Buddhist Path to Simplicity. And she's the co-founder of Gaia House. And that's a retreat center in England. And she's a senior teacher at the Insight Meditation Community. She lives in Devon in England. And the article was written with Jaya Rudgard, who's an Insight Meditation and mindfulness teacher also, who leads retreats and courses in the UK and internationally. So in this article, Christina was talking about mindfulness and the 7 factors of awakening. And one of the things she said was that mindfulness, as we know, is a word that's been absorbed into our culture. And it's important to appreciate the depth and the nuances of what mindfulness can offer us. And so I'm going to refer a little to that article. One of the things that is sort of included in this idea of mindfulness and it being familiar, the root of the word sati is remembering or recollecting. And in a sense, when we practice this, we're coming to our senses, that we're becoming present to the immediacy of our experience. And doing this is like the on switch for the whole cascade of the awakening factors to follow. And there are so many descriptions of mindfulness. But there's the root meaning of the word. Oftentimes it's accompanied by another word, which is sampajana. And that means all around knowing, or knowing the context in which things are actually happening. Sampajana focuses on really comprehending, seeing clearly the present. Sati is almost sort of applying lessons from the past. I mean, the past might have been a moment ago. So mindfulness and sati sampajana, they have a different emphasis, and mindfulness and clear comprehension of the purpose, they often appear in this compounded Pali term, sati sampajana. And they can be considered very close in meaning. And sometimes they're interchangeable. But there's no precise word in English for this kind of recollection. It's difficult to come up with a definition that evokes its spirit. And so One might say that it's going about one's daily life without ever forgetting our higher purpose, but that still doesn't really bring out the full sense of sampajana, because forgetting refers to something you're trying to remember from the past rather than the future goal that you aspire. And so sampajana has more of a sense of insight around it than the more psychological ideal of memory. You not only, it's not what you are doing, but why you're doing it. And it's this twofold sense that Buddhism, that the Buddha himself, encourages his followers to be aware, clearly comprehending, and mindful. You hear that in a lot of the quotes from the suttas, clearly comprehending and mindful. And so, kind of the question is, what are we remembering? We're remembering the present moment. We're remembering that we're here, that we're now, it's now. And we're also remembering the context of what we know about the teachings and about what's useful to remember, and the context of our intentions. Some of the things that I brought up in our sitting practice of, sort of reminding ourselves of our intentions to stay present in the moment. And so what we can sort of ask ourselves as we're in the practice is, do we feed the qualities that really enliven us and that bring us to embodiment and free us? Or are we unconsciously choosing to foster and repeat the patterns that create confusion? The hindrances, also called the defilements, or these veiling patterns that pull us in the direction of constantly increasing confusion and forgetfulness, feeling lost and overwhelmed and sometimes dissociated, of being submerged in ill will and craving and doubt, worry, or simply checking out. And so the 7 factors of enlightenment pull us in the direction of that which we most deeply value and aspire to. And they pull us in the direction of freedom. Sati, as an awakening factor, includes an intention toward liberation. So it's not just being mindful of what's happening in the present moment, but as an awakening factor, it's intention toward liberation. And we're not simply learning to relax, although that's very valuable. And we're moving toward liberation or freedom. Mindfulness has been described as the path to the deathless. It's a step-by-step practice that takes us in the direction of unbinding, freedom from the afflictive habits and patterns that trap us in suffering. And so it's also a gateway into the experience of peace. There's this kind of creative tension. We see that in the process of waking up, there's a certain tension between these 2 different poles. It's easy sometimes to see this as being a very negative tension. People can become judgmental of themselves and, oh, there I am again, lost in craving, or lost in aversion, or lost in doubt, or lost in sleepiness. But this isn't really negative tension. We can see it as being a creative tension. Where would we cultivate joyfulness other than in the midst of craving for sensual pleasure? Where would we cultivate courage and energy except in the midst of those moments of numbness and dissociation? Right there, stuck in the middle of almost falling asleep or being so confused. I mean, it happens to me, I just space out. And yet, that right there, cultivating courage and energy right in the middle of that, is the best place to cultivate it. Where can we cultivate connectedness? Except in those moments of being agitated and scattered and fragmented. And so we're becoming present to the immediacy of our experience. So we need to know at different times in our day what element of mindfulness is really helpful to us. Is it investigative awareness? Is it learning to reframe our perceptions? Is it learning to draw on our extended family of mindfulness out of kindness or compassion or joyousness or equanimity? It's a noble aspiration, waking up, and the path isn't easy. And there are moments of true joy and celebration and appreciation, and there are moments of doubt and despair, and we welcome the challenge of emerging from a habit-driven, compulsive life in a way of being and inhabiting this life where we flourish and we're creative and engaged and where we feel free. Another way to look at mindfulness is to know directly what is happening as it's happening, and a certain quality of attentiveness to this present moment in a relaxed way. It requires a relaxed sense of presence. We can't sustain that attentiveness if it's not a relaxed attention. It's a certain effort, as we've talked about before, but it's a relaxed attention. And sometimes it's useful to think of qualities in terms of what they're not. And our attentiveness to the present moment is not a kind of hypervigilance, but it's a relaxed form of presence. And there's also a caring that happens in mindfulness. There's an inherent respectfulness and caring. It's attuned to an embodied sense of attentiveness. So the use of the word mindfulness may sort of obscure the fact that there's actually an engagement of the heart and the whole body in the knowing of this moment. One of the images of mindfulness in the suttas that I like comes from a discourse on mindfulness of breathing. And it likens the attention of mindfulness to being the sort of attention that a skilled wood turner would apply to turning his wood, knowing exactly the quality of movement that he's making. Or maybe in more modern terms, we might think of a potter, the sense of appreciativeness, sensitivity, and really contacting and feeling what's happening in the present moment that's captured in that image. If we're a skilled craftsperson or woodworking person, what is the quality of the attentiveness that we bring to the path? And mindfulness also is appropriate to the situation at hand. Sometimes our mindfulness will be more relaxed. Sometimes it needs to be a little bit more sharp and on point. There's another beautiful image of the cowherd tending the cows in a situation where there's no crops for the cows to trample on. The cowherd can just sit back and watch what's happening and in a relaxed manner, but sometimes something needs a little bit more direct intervention. And then the cowherd gets up and does something about it. I'd actually have to jump up and stop the cows from trampling the crops. And at the same time, we notice that our minds stray into a territory where some more direct intervention is needed. We might be repeating a habit that we have that shows up in our minds over and over again. And so we can jump up at that moment, and maybe we're aware of sounds happening around the room, and then something comes up like my dog barks, or something gets our attention that really distracts us, and we want to leap up and do something about it. So mindfulness has this restraining quality, where rather than having a knee-jerk reaction to what's happening, we can actually have the choice to ask, is this something that really needs a response right now? Or is it something that I can just allow to be and allow to go? And this is what mindfulness offers, the choice point between acting on habit and responding appropriately to a given situation. It monitors and balances the qualities in the mind. When we know that there's a lot of energy in the mind, we can pay more attention to calming factors in the mind. And when we notice that we're becoming dull, we can actually choose to sharpen up our attention. And in this way, mindfulness monitors and oversees the activities of the mind in our practice and can rebalance them, like we were talking about earlier, can rebalance them accordingly. And we can also be aware of the comings and goings of mindfulness itself. One of the ways we're invited to practice mindfulness of these mind states, mindfulness of mind states, there's the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and one of them is the mindfulness of mind states. And so we notice their presence and their absence, and we notice the conditions that support their arising and the conditions that support their waning. To be aware even of the comings and goings of the mind itself is excellent mindfulness practice. And at any moment, we can just pause and recollect where we are and re-engage with this quality of sati and remembering. And when the Buddha talked about the 7 factors of enlightenment, it's also called the Bojjhanga, or the awakening factors. He speaks about developing this quality of mind to know when it's appropriate to cultivate any one of the awakening factors. If there's restlessness, it's not the right time to cultivate investigation. It's time to cultivate calm. And if there's dullness, well, then this is the time to be cultivating more investigation. But he also said that it's always an appropriate moment to cultivate mindfulness, because mindfulness really has the effect of illuminating the moment. One of those nuances of mindfulness is just developing the capacity to simply know what's happening within us and around us. And that can sound so easy, but it isn't. So much of our knowing is filtered through interpretations, through memories, through associations, perceptions, likes and dislikes. There's a remarkable calming effect that comes from simply knowing a thought as a thought, a sound as a sound, a sight as a sight. And in many ways, this dimension of mindfulness is actually one of the most transformative, because it's the place where we step out of the eye of the storm, so to speak, and develop a dialogue, a relationship with what's being experienced inwardly and outwardly. And we can step out of identifying with what's being experienced as being me or who I am or a self-definition. And so another dimension of mindfulness that's deeply important is protective awareness, is discernment. We learn that what it means to be a sort of wise gatekeeper within our own hearts and our own minds. There's a very big difference between protective awareness and defensive awareness. Protective awareness is, it's not about shutting the world out or being life denying. It's actually engaging in the quality of discernment inwardly, of knowing what leads to distress and to the end of distress. So we're right back there at the first noble truth. What leads to distress? What do we notice leads to distress? And it's not about judgment. It's having the discernment to know what's useful to cultivate and what's not useful to cultivate. As we've been talking about a few times, the understanding that the Buddha showed us those 4 ways to approach our thoughts as they arise, becoming sensitive to conditions that evolve unskillful energies, and that's guarding. And then there's abandoning. We abandon unskillful energies once they have arisen, but it takes courage to drop the familiar and open to the unknown. And then there's nurturing of arousing positive mental qualities that haven't yet arisen. Those 7 factors of enlightenment, those are positive mental qualities that might not yet have arisen, but we can pay attention to when we notice. Mindfulness, investigation, effort, rapture, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity, nurturing positive mental qualities. And then we can maintain, we can increase and develop the skillful qualities that have arisen. So mindfulness, this is where we kind of turn to that Pali word of bojjhanga, these limbs or factors describe qualities and capacities that we already have. They're present in our consciousness. They're seeds of potential reality that we're invited to nurture and to identify and appreciate and strengthen. And in the early text, the qualities are referred to as an inner wealth, or as the 7 treasures that protect us against pain and adversity, instead inclining the heart toward awakening. The Buddha said that when these 7 qualities are cultivated and brought to fruition, they free the mind and heart from all form of bondage and suffering. And they incline the mind toward liberation, or nibbana. If we ask ourselves what the mind of a Buddha would look like, my understanding is that the mind of a Buddha is infused with these 7 qualities, these factors that open up the treasures in our hearts and lead to awakening. And so some of the factors that help pave the way for these enlightenment factors to be more present is mindfulness, learning to be here, learning to inhabit this body and mind and moment fully. The second is living in the light of our understanding of change, our understanding of impermanence, of unsustainability, of conditionality. that conditions, trying to grasp onto conditions is not sustainable. And so our understanding that what leads to distress and what leads to the end of distress. And then there's the third set of factors that support awakening is contentment or ease in our lives. The 5 traditional sense doors, the sense door of the mind also, are all in service of sensitivity and respect and care, and being mindful of the kind of footprint we're leaving on the world in every moment, and the kind of footprint we leave in our own hearts, what arises and comes to us at our sense doors. And then there's the support awakening, developing skillful, wise attentiveness, not grasping at sensory impressions or our associations with them, but having wise attention. And I think the last of the factors that really supports the flourishing of the awakening factors is trust and confidence in the capacity that we have to be awake and to walk this path with courage, fearlessness, and trust. And this can take the development of equanimity. One of the images of the Buddha that's used to describe the awakening factors is of the waters high in the Himalayas that gather in pools and then flow into streams and then into rivers and gradually down toward the ocean. And in the same way as we engage in these qualities, the mind naturally starts to dissolve those afflictive patterns and then inclines us toward freedom and understanding. And the awakening factors are sometimes referred to as anti-hindrances. It's a way of practicing the qualities that can actually provide an antidote to the pathway out of it offers the pathway out of the more afflictive qualities of the mind. I think when I first was introduced to the Dhamma practice, I had this impression that I had to work to overcome the hindrances before I could settle into anything that was more enjoyable. But actually, we can practice from the beginning by engaging these brightening qualities of the mind. They feel good to cultivate, and they really speak to the way the Buddha described his path as one that is beautiful in the beginning, beautiful in the middle, and beautiful in the end. And it can yield fruit immediately. We don't have to wait for the final epiphany. We can actually start to taste the flavor of awakening as we walk along the path. So that's probably enough of what I want to say about mindfulness and the 7 factors. I'll just remind you that the 7 factors are mindfulness, investigation, effort, rapture or piti, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. So when we find ourselves with some unskillful, repetitious thoughts arising, there are many things we can incline the mind toward. We can just let it go naturally, or we can apply our awareness and our wisdom to investigate a little and incline the mind toward loving kindness, toward compassion, toward joy or equanimity, or we can remind ourselves or notice when mindfulness is present and investigation is present, energy is present, joy is present, tranquility, when we have a deeper concentration, when we might notice ourselves in equanimity, that we aren't falling into extremes or we aren't falling into ill will about ourselves or others. So having this, active practice and knowing that there's the antidotes, there are these anti-hindrance anecdotes, is one of the joys of being reminded of the awakening factor of mindfulness, and then the 7 factors of awakening as something to incline the mind toward when we're lost in some other kind of delusion and repetitive thinking and things like that. So I think I've probably said enough, and let's just let the words settle down for a few minutes and then have some conversation.